let's get into it. These are the big headlines this week. Bob Iger going crazy in his book.
I have good news for you, my lord.
That's good news.
Come closer, I have good news.
He's not going crazy. I think it's crazy he released the book. It's a
that's what I'm thinking. You know, his initial retirement date had him at the summer of 2019. So I wonder if this book was scheduled to drop after he stepped down.
Right. I wonder.
I forgot about that book. Hey, can you postpone the book?
No,
we can't.
It's going out. It's whether you like it or not.
Right,
I don't supposed to retire.
That's one company that Disney doesn't own is Random House. I don't think that.
I think you're 100% right. I think Bob put this book together with the idea that it would cap off his career at the Walt Disney Company. And because let's face it, the book is not closed on his career at Walt Disney. But
the title of the book, The Ride of the Lifetime, it kind of infers that you know it's in the rearview mirror, looking back on all this. But I don't see Bob going anywhere until this Disney Plus is well up and running. This is his baby.
Yeah, that is, and it was the Fox acquisition that really, I think it was Rupert Murdoch who said, you have to be there to see this transition through. So these big shot executives, you know, they place a lot of faith in Bob Iger. I think he seems like somebody that people like doing business with. Steve Jobs certainly liked him a lot, at least according to Bob. And, well, I mean, let's face it, it's his book.
Right.
So I just found it to be absolutely just really interesting. And it comes from such a perspective that I have a hard time wrapping my head around because of the mere power of the position that this guy has. So Bob Iger, he devoted in the entire chapter 11, to the acquisition of Star Wars. And I listened to that audiobook chapter 3 times. Now it's 45 minutes long. And
it's great stuff. I mean, it reads like a drama almost, because he takes you step by step, going back to the initial conversation that he and George had about the possibility. I mean, it was what surprised me, Jim, about the beginning, the origins of this acquisition, is that it wasn't George's idea. It was Bob Iger's idea. They had just acquired Marvel, and they were looking across the landscape of entertainment and seeing what else might fit their portfolio nicely. And one of them was Star Wars. In fact, he had the initial conversation with Steve Jobs. And Steve said,
yes,
hey, we'll call George. And of course, Steve Jobs knew George Lucas very well because Pixar had its origins at Lucasfilm.
Mm-hmm. He suggested they go meet up with George at Skywalker Ranch and have lunch with him and pick his brain a little bit and see how he felt about that. But unfortunately, Jobs got sick and passed away, and that date never happened. But it was even before the acquisition of Marvel when Iger reveals in the book. It was after the Pixar acquisition when they started looking at other content franchises that they can snatch up. And especially after the Pixar thing, it was so successful for them and for Disney Animation that they were able to kind of meld the two companies together and have them both benefit each other so well. They were riding high on that. So they went and purchased Marvel for $4 billion and set their sights on Lucasfilm as a company. It was their corporate strategy to snatch up Lucasfilm, but they weren't sure George was going to sell. And Iger saw his opportunity to get his foot in the door when the Star Tours revamp, Star Tours 2, The Adventures Continue, it opened up at Disney on May 20th, 2011, and Iger had made the arrangements for George and Melody Hobson, George's then girlfriend / fiance, and George to sit down and have breakfast the morning of that launch, that big deal. I remember watching it on a live stream.
It was a big whoop-de-doo.
It was a big whoop-de-doo. Logan was there, up on stage for that one, and a few other Star Wars bigwigs, and George, and of course Bob Iger. So they went out to breakfast, and that's when Bob started to condition George, really, and get him into the idea that making a sale to Disney could actually be possible. Let's cut one. By the way, we should. Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
I want to mention that this is not Bob Iger actually narrating his own audiobook. It's a guy named Jim Frangione. And
it's not even RFR Bob Iger.
Yeah.
They could have got him.
We should have had RFR Bob do it. They could have got him. Yeah. I would have negotiated that deal myself. But so this is not Bob Iger. Bob actually does do a segment at the very end of the audiobook where he gives you an appendix of these life lessons he learned while running Disney. So he actually comes on for that. But for the bulk of the book, it's Bob's story is being told from a first-person perspective by Jim Frangione. So here's cut one, Bob Iger pitching the sale to Lucas for the very first time.
When George and his fiancée, Melody Hobson, arrived, they were surprised to see that no one was there but me. We sat down and had a lovely breakfast, and about halfway through it, I asked George if he'd ever thought about selling. I tried to be clear and direct without offending him. He was 68 years old at the time, and I said, "I don't want to be fatalistic, George, and please stop me if you would rather not have this conversation, but I think it's worth putting this on the table. What happens down the road? You don't have any heirs who are going to run the company for you. They may control it, but they're not going to run it. Shouldn't you determine who protects or carries on your legacy?" He nodded as I talked. "I'm not really ready to sell," he said. "But you're right. And if I decide to, there isn't anyone I want to sell to but you."
So there you go. May 2000, what was that? 2011.
2011.
May 2011. You're right, because you mentioned, and we talked about this off the air, the way that Iger, a very corporate guy, very coldly explains these things. And you just hear him say, "George, not to be fatalistic, but you're 68 years old. You have no heirs." And, at this point, George has 3 children. 3 adopted children, certainly all off going and doing their own things. But, for Iger to, I guess that was part of the conversation. None of those kids wanted to pick up the mantle and run the company, or George didn't want the kids to pick up the mantle and run the company, which is interesting because it was, George's whole, one of his big moments with his own father was when he decided to create his own path and not take over the family business. Do you think that he even offered that to the kids? Like, what kid doesn't want to say, "Yeah, I'll take over and run the company and be the head of Star Wars"? I guess it's different when it's your dad and it's in the family. Outside looking in, that seems like something that would be a no-brainer. Why not do that? What's the downside? But Bob cuts to the quick and says, "Look, you're old. Your kids aren't going to be taking over. Have you ever considered selling?"
It must have been a conversation the two of them had, maybe during breakfast itself, before Bob jumped into it. Because what I have always known about George Lucas is that when he would sit down with creative individuals that he was going to consider hiring on to work with, or even cast members for films that he was directing, he would sit down and only talk about family stuff with people and not really get into anything about the technical aspects of the job that they're ultimately talking about. It would all be very homey and talking about family stuff.
Right.
I've always heard that about George.
Despite his reputation of being kind of aloof and reclusive and all of that, it's interesting to hear that. And you're right that when he does get together, it's on a very personal level.
Yeah,
and
well,
not
he's a
about
family
the
man.
business. Yeah,
he's a family man.
He
He raised those kids by himself.
Right.
I mean, really. And so that was probably part of the conversation. And Iger snatched onto that, or just that little nugget of knowledge, knowing that George wasn't really grooming one of his offspring or another family member to take over the company. Then I think that indicated to Bob that that would be a good strategy to go in there and really get personal with him about it. Yeah. And of course, George, the clock is ticking. Let's face it here. You don't really keep yourself in very good shape. Or no, it was like he said he was always very respectful of George. Yes. But while Bob was having his fruit plate, I think George was having like a 4-egg bacon cheddar omelet for breakfast. Hey, I'll power to him,
The greasy stuff.
The greasy stuff. There you go. There you go. So 7 months later, George calls Iger and says, I'm interested in talking about that thing we were talking about. And so that puts it around December 2011. And at the beginning of 2012, Lucasfilm released Red Tails. And George was going out giving interviews. And he gave an interview to the New York Times where he dropped the fact that he was leaning toward winding down his career and retiring. And then in March 2012, those guys from TMZ encountered George out in a parking lot, and they pulled the camera out, and George went, I'm retired. They're like, come on, Lucas, more Star Wars. And he's like, I'm retired. We have that audio. We should play that in just a second. I'm trying to walk down the timeline here a little bit. So at this point, George is in active talks with Disney about selling Lucasfilm. And so they opened up the books, and George's CFO worked with Bob Iger's team so they can establish a value for the company.
Yes, the valuation. Now, this is a really fascinating part, because the fact that Lucasfilm was not a publicly traded company, they weren't beholden to a lot of the record-keeping standards, rules, regulations that you would have with such a company. So, it's a privately owned company. So them going through and having to piece together through memos and scraps of paper, it was a very difficult process for them, very different than what they encountered with, Marvel or...
But let's be fair, it's not like George was running Lucasfilm out of his garage. It was
sure sounds like that when you hear Iger talk about it. Well, they struggled to create that valuation.
To a publicly traded company like Disney, it's a way different animal, and they had to figure out how much it was really worth.
Yep.
And so they put a price on it. George wanted the Pixar deal, and I think Pixar came at about $7.5 billion.
Right.
And Iger explains, but they had 6 films in production in various stages of production at that point in time. The money was there.
Well, and Disney had already partnered with Pixar at that point and distributed Pixar films. So they were a proven quantity and a proven partner. Lasseter cut his teeth at Disney.
Yes, so you have to keep in mind that Michael Eisner had a very rocky relationship with Steve Jobs and Pixar, and that's what eventually led to Eisner essentially being forced out by the thing that really did it was Walt Disney's nephew Roy came after Michael
his brother. That was his brother, Walt's brother.
No. That was his nephew. His brother passed away in 1971. The original Roy.
This is Roy Jr. Oh, pardon me. Okay.
Yeah. See, I went
you know this stuff. All right.
I've been obsessed with Eisner's book. After I went through the Star Wars chapter, I went through the rest of the book from essentially Bob Iger being brought on as COO of the Disney company.
Right.
So, I know his story really well. I think that Bob was kind of burnt by that problem he ran into. Actually, he was actually the one who sort of fixed the problem with Roy Disney Jr. And showed him some respect and was able to put out that fire. And then Roy Disney Jr. died in 2009. But Eisner brought in Lasseter, like you said, with Pixar, but Pixar became more a part of the Disney machine. They really kind of brought Pixar in, and that, they call it Disney Pixar.
Right.
And there's a reason for that, because it's Lasseter did more than just Pixar. He also helped restructure Disney animation and help forge that ahead. So he was more of a team player, a Disney team player, Lasseter, when they brought him in. With the Marvel guys, the Arid brothers, those guys were in the whole New York scene with Marvel became really hard for Disney to work with, and they eventually blew all that up. And got rid of the brothers and moved a lot of the operations under the Disney roof, Yeah,
and that didn't take very long either.
No, that blew up pretty fast.
Yeah.
And so I think Iger is really now, as he's working on acquiring Lucasfilm, he wants Disney to take it over, and he doesn't want George Lucas to be retaining any creative control. He wants a blank slate that he can develop with his filmmakers and everything. And Iger's very straight up about this in the book. He's extremely straight up. And it was a big area of contention when they were negotiating together. George wanted the Pixar deal. Disney came in under $4 billion as a value for Lucasfilm. But they were willing to spend a little more because they really wanted Lucasfilm. So how did they come up with the $4.05 billion price for Lucasfilm? Well, they just took the Marvel deal and gave George just a little bit more money. And so,
that was an ego stroke. You could tell by the way Iger sort of presents that moment that it was... He wasn't going to get the Pixar deal, but he had damn well better get more than Marvel.
Right. So that's the little cherry he gave George. He gave him the Marvel deal plus a little extra. But with that little extra, that changed Iger's approach to Star Wars films. He wanted to release one every other year.
Yeah.
But then now they're paying more money than they had planned on for Lucasfilm. So that's when they amped up their approach and decided to do saga film and then Star Wars story film alternating each year. That's because they had to spend more money on Lucasfilm. But that's not even really where all the drama comes in. The dollars and cents, that's not where the drama comes from. George got paid a buttload of money. He gave half of it away. And the
other thing that I want to point out, I just want to throw this out, is that the timing of this worked because the federal government was about to pass some pretty heavy tax burdens on capital gains. And so George wanted to expedite the sale that would save him about $500 million. So half $500 million he otherwise would have gone to taxes. So for all of you that are talking about, the rich don't pay enough and all
you Robin Hoods out there.
Well, I mean, just saying, all these billionaires that talk about, I wish I could pay more in taxes. I really want to. The government needs to tax me more. Well, George Lucas had an opportunity to pay $500 million more to the U.S. Treasury. He's like, no, hurry up the deal so I don't have to pay the taxes.
And at that point, there was some rocky negotiations going on, not over dollars and cents, but over George Lucas's creative control of Star Wars. George was trying to rig the deal so that he would be able to sell Lucasfilm, but continue to work on Star Wars projects as the buck stops here kind of guy.
Yeah. I think he wanted to be the John Lasseter of Lucasfilm.
Yes. Yeah, but he made it clear
the
he didn't want to be
director.
An employee. Mm-hmm. He made it clear he did not want to be an employee.
Right.
So he wanted to maintain a really lofty high position in the corporate world and in, the Hollywood world too, which is something that I don't know, George, it's the perfect storm really, because George had spent his whole career cutting himself away from Hollywood. And so now he wanted his baby, Star Wars, to be taking care of the biggest Hollywood entity there is, and he still wanted to play in the sandbox.
Well, this is
being told he has to go in to go eat dinner.
This is the having his cake and eat it too moment for George. He wanted the $4.01 billion or whatever it was,
right?
And he wanted creative control over the product. And Bob had to set him straight on that.
And he does, and he talks about it in the book.
There was only one person with creative control, George. He wanted to retain that control without becoming an employee. It would have been a dereliction of my responsibilities to spend more than $4 billion and then say, essentially, this is still yours. Go ahead and make whatever movies you want to make on whatever timeline you can make them. Few people in the film business commanded as much respect as George. Star Wars had only ever been his. No matter how much he understood intellectually that he was selling the company, and it didn't make sense that he would retain creative control, his entire self was wrapped up in the fact that he was responsible for what was perhaps the greatest mythology of our time. That's a hard thing to let go, and I was deeply sensitive to that. The last thing I wanted to do was insult him. I also knew we couldn't spend this money and do what George wanted, and that saying that to him would put the whole deal at risk. That is exactly what happened. We agreed to a price quickly, but then we negotiated back and forth for several months over what his role would be. It was difficult for him to cede control of the ongoing Star Wars saga, and it made no sense for us not to have it. We went over and over the same ground. George saying he couldn't just hand over his legacy, me saying we couldn't buy it and not control it, and twice walked away from the table and called the deal off. We walked the first time and George walked the second.
So there you go.
Now that answers, to me, that answers number one, that rumor that was going on out there that said George Lucas retained the rights to some of his characters and situations. That's why you don't see classic aliens in Star Wars films, because George owns Greedo, things like that. And Disney would have to pony up the bill every time they used it. That's why they didn't use the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy in Galaxy's Edge, is because they'd have to pony up all this cash to George. Well, that's not it. You have to understand, and it's made crystal clear when you listen to Bob Iger's book. The Disney Corporation purchased Lucasfilm and got 100% of Lucasfilm. Now, sure, there are people who point at, well, George still owns the archives. Yeah, because George saved all that stuff. A lot of that stuff would have been typically thrown away by a movie studio until guys like George Lucas came along and started saving this stuff. And then over time, you start realizing, auction houses especially started realizing that there is a value for this stuff among collectors. But
right, just because he owns a model of the Death Star doesn't mean that he retains the intellectual rights to the concept of the Death Star. Exactly. That was all purchased.
And George isn't the only filmmaker who walked away from Star Wars with pieces of props and sets and you name it, and wardrobe, etc. He's not the only one.
Right.
He realized, though, pretty early, though, that that's stuff that he should hold on to. By the time he got to the prequel era, he had that under lock and key. And that was his prerogative. Otherwise, that stuff would have all just been recycled anyway. It was Lucasfilm who created the whole idea of putting film props out in movies, in museums,
right,
and creating all that. I don't recall that really happening outside of when George started with the Magic of the Myth.
Right.
No,
there was nothing even remotely like that. And in that quote that we just played from Iger's book, he says, created the the most important mythology of our time. I mean, that sums it up. And Iger repeatedly says over and over that George it was never about characters. It was never about intellectual property, nothing like that. This was his legacy. He goes on to say, George told him that when he dies, the first line of his obituary is, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, has died. That he knows that is inextricably linked to him. That is his legacy. And so you can understand how difficult this would be for George to part ways with it. And, the way Iger describes it, intellectually, George understood it. The businessman side of George understood that Iger was making the right call and was advocating for the right thing for Disney. But he just couldn't bear the thought of it. And I don't think George, and according to Bob Iger, I think he agrees, was acting or thinking rationally. You are not rational about your children, your legacy, these things that are so personally tied to you. It's impossible to think rationally about them. And I understand where George is coming from when you say he wanted his cake and he wanted to eat it too. This was his baby. These were his kids.
But George did try to do some maneuvering to get himself into a position where he could slide into exactly what he wanted. And the way he did that was he realized the company would have more value if he started to actively get a film into production. Right. So he went after the sequel trilogy. And
so here you got the evaluation coming at a certain level. George says, I want the Pixar treatment. Iger says, well, you can't have the Pixar treatment. They've got 6 movies in pre-production. They've got John Lasseter. They've got all this talent. They've got this entire think tank of people developing projects all the time. They literally wrote a book about the creative process. All Lucasfilm has is you. They didn't say they have the story group. They have none of that came up. They didn't talk about Dave Filoni. They didn't talk about Clone Wars. Nothing. All Lucasfilm has in terms of creative is you. And so George goes, oh, well, hold on a second. Here, I've got these movies in development. 7, 8, 9. Yeah, it's going to be a big hit.
And that comes up in the book.
Yes.
Cut 3.
Yeah, just being stubborn here.
At some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines. One for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who had just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out. It was an upcoming change in capital gains laws that eventually salvaged the negotiations. If we didn't close the deal by the end of 2012, George, who owned Lucasfilm outright, would take a roughly $500 million hit on the sale. If he was going to sell to us, there was some financial urgency to come to an agreement quickly. He knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept. And so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. This was not a hard promise to make. Of course, we would be open to George Lucas's ideas. But like the outlines, we would be under no obligation.
But I have a feeling that was some legal mumbo jumbo that was put into the paperwork. But there was a mixed signal being sent to George, because when he sold them his treatments, I think that there was an inference that Disney was going to move forward with those treatments, and he would be able to work on those stories as a consultant. And really,
I think George was trying to replicate the model that he had with episodes, 5 and 6, where he was going to be able to oversee the development of the story, be the wizard behind the director's shoulder, or over the director's shoulder, like he was with Kirsch and Marquand. And again, he was going to be in this ultimate position where he didn't have all the risk, but he maintained this creative control. The question that I have about these treatments, and we'll get into this a little bit later because I think we have some quotes from George coming up about these ideas, is honestly, Jim, if we're being real honest with ourselves, how developed do you think these story ideas were? I mean, just months before, a year before, he was saying, it's over. Retired, done.
Right. Yeah.
They're just gonna, the fans are just gonna hate my stuff. They just make fun of me. They don't like my stuff. They didn't like Phantom Menace. And all of a sudden now he's got 3 treatments for 3 new films that just happen to appear at the time when Disney is evaluating. Now, granted, George is I can't even begin to touch the creativity of a genius like a George Lucas. So even George's, maybe rushed story treatments and concepts about Star Wars is going to be better than most. But how great were these things?
Well, keep in mind, George was talking about doing 12 episodes of Star Wars back in the 70s. So he may have had some outlines that were in various stages of development going all the way back to the 70s that he's had stashed away, and ideas that he's been just mulling over but never really wanted to dive back into the whole process of guiding a company through 3 films again. So he shelved it. And
those story treatments.
I think there was that happened at a time when there was question as to whether George was going to sell to Disney, and George was planting this as something that he can nurture and keep himself with essentially job security when it comes to Star Wars. Look what I have.
Right.
I have these treatments. We were talking about like whether or not these were half-baked things he just whipped up over a weekend. Mm-hmm. I really think that with George's attention to detail about Star Wars and the way the guy nurtures ideas and builds worlds, these are concepts that he has had banging around in his head for decades.
I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Yes.
So he lays these on Iger, and Iger feigns excitement about it and realizes that if he purchases these things, it will really sweeten the deal for George. But they never had any intention on actually executing these ideas in this script. It just didn't happen.
I mean, but Iger in the book really doesn't reveal any feelings that he has about what those treatments were, whether he felt they were good, not good. He just said that he and Alan Horn felt compelled to buy them. And he doesn't really expound on that, but we can certainly infer, as you did, Jim, correctly, I think, that it was about a little bit of ego stroking and making George feel really good about it.
What's interesting about this is a lot of my information about the sale of Disney to, the sale of Star Wars and Lucasfilm to Disney, a lot of my information from behind the scenes came from a 2013 article in Bloomberg, which
I remember that.
and I always I always refer to this article. It's how Disney bought Lucasfilm and its plans for Star Wars, the inside story of how Disney bought Lucasfilm. And in that article,
aren't you quoted in that?
Oh, I think you are. I think
maybe I am. Rebel Force Radio is brought up in that article.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. That let me see here.
I haven't thought about that in a long time. I remember getting a copy of it.
Well, this article came out in early 2013, and it really pulled back the curtain on a lot of how the deal went down with George and Lucasfilm.
And I believe they were reaching out to see what the what fandom was saying about it, and of course, they looked to Rebel Force Radio.
Yeah, it's such a long article. I'm pretty sure there's a Jason Swank quote in here among the Alan Horn comments and the Bob Iger comments. So the reason I keep this close to my fingertips is because, especially recently, I used it as reference for when I was researching this rumor that George Lucas still retained some rights to Star Wars characters. And we shot that rumor down, I think, pretty well. Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Is this it?
Oh,
I think it's a real weak quote, if I remember.
It's like Disney sent excitable Star Wars fans into a frenzy by unveiling a plan to release the long-promised final trilogy starting in 2015. Their enthusiasm reached a crescendo, I should say, in January when J.J. Abrams, director of the acclaimed 2009 rebooting of Star Trek, signed on to oversee the first film. Quote, "It's like a dream come true."
Oh!
Gushes. Jason Swank, co-host of Rebel Force Radio, a weekly podcast. Gushes.
Is that all they quoted me? They didn't even... What, a dream? They just pulled the dream come true? That's all they got. Well,
I think there's another Swank comment in here somewhere. I think they brought you back for something. It's hard
at the time, and you know what? I still, when I was watching episode 8 over the weekend, as I said, I kept thinking to myself, God, I'd rather be watching episode 7. I still love episode 7, Force Awakens. I still love the way it makes me feel. I still love the memory of Jimmy Mack running through and high-fiving that room full of Star Wars fans there at Star Wars Celebration when we saw that full trailer and the Chewie we're home moment.
Chewie. I'm dead, Chewie. I'm dead.
I'll always love that film, and it is a really fun, good movie, and I think a very worthy addition to the Star Wars cinematic canon. I'll always believe that. But
so in this article, it is talked about when that moment when George laid those treatments on the Disney corporate guys.
Which we now know as Alan Horn, Bob Iger. Was there? And he said 3 copies. Well, Horn, Iger, and George, I guess.
No, Braverman. Iger, Horn, and John Braverman, who's some corporate exec. But so here's where I run into an issue, is because the 2013 article from Bloomberg has quotes from Bob Iger saying that once Lucas got assurances from Disney in writing about the broad outlines of the deal, George agreed to turn over the treatments, but insisted they could only be read by Iger, Horn, and Kevin Mayer, Disney's executive vice president for corporate strategy.
That's and it gets a little confusing when you're listening to the book. You have Iger talking about Kevin throughout, and he's not talking about Feige. He's talking about Kevin Mayer, the CFO. Is he the CFO?
He was the executive vice president for corporate strategy.
Okay. All right. Not CFO.
Corporate strategy. But in Iger's book, 6 years later, he says that the treatments could only be read by Iger, Horn, and John Braverman, who is, some Disney mucky muck. I've learned so much about Disney and all of this behind the scenes stuff that I never really knew before. A lot of the stuff in Iger's book is probably not that revelatory to people who really closely follow Disney behind the scenes.
Right. The Disney fanatics. Right. Yeah.
Not like the way I've always followed Lucasfilm behind the scenes, which I know pretty well. I have a pretty good perspective of their entire history and all the players involved. So I just wonder why there's now this discrepancy as to who got these story treatments. It's still only 3 people, but instead of it being Iger, Horn, and Mayer, it's now Iger, Horn, and Braverman. So, I mean, those little things, I could shake up a courtroom if I'm Harry Mason, I could point out these discrepancies in the story.
Mr. Iger, in your autobiography, you mention for sure.
And as Star Wars fans who study this behind the scenes stuff, that's a lot of times what we have to do is piece together the evidence.
Yes.
So, and that's what we're doing here, and we're getting Bob Iger's story. And I'm sure this is going to be the first of many stories about this. So the story treatments, Iger bought them. I am 100% convinced Iger bought them as part of the negotiation process to soften George and make sure that sale went through. And because Bob had targeted Lucasfilm years ago and had long been conditioning George to sell to him. And at this point in the negotiations, Bob mentions his book. Disney walked away from the table at one point. George walked away from the table at another point. And this is when all of a sudden those story treatments emerged.
Yes.
Iger and Horn together conspired and said, listen, we have to say we both really like these scripts and that we're buying them because we're interested in their potential. You got to back me up on this, Alan Horn. And so Horn's like, oh, yes, okay, let's do that. We have to do that because that's how we'll get George to sign Bob Iger. And so they're like, all right. Well, who else should we include in this? Braverman or Meyer? Oh, damn. And then years later, he couldn't remember which one.
Yeah, one of the two.
Was the third who was like
one
outside of
what'd you call them, mucky mucks? One of the two corporate mucky mucks.
But this is how corporate America works behind the scenes. And it ain't pretty. It's not pretty because you're seeing now the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, getting manipulated and conditioned to do exactly what a corporate CEO wants him to do. Right. And this is the stuff George Lucas ran away from Hollywood for. This is why he's always been so protective of Star Wars. Is because of this sort of studio manipulation that these guys do.
So as Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and we are merely the players. In is about to walk another major character in this drama, and that's Kathleen Kennedy. Now, I'm going to go a little out of order, Jim, of what you have, because we've got the next audio clip is about the day that Disney bought Lucasfilm. But Kathleen Kennedy came in as a player in Lucasfilm prior to that purchase. So this is the thing. So here you got George wanting to have creative control, but not wanting to be an employee. So what does he do? He hires a new president of his company, Kathleen Kennedy, someone he's very familiar with, has a long history with, going back to the first Indiana Jones film. She's going to come in. She's going to be the president of Lucasfilm. He's doing this. He's hiring her knowing that he is prepping this company that he just hired her to run for sale to Disney.
Right, but he doesn't fill her in.
But he doesn't fill her in,
he
right?
He tells her, I'm working on new Star Wars movies.
Exactly. I want to make
oh my God, new Star Wars.
And I want you to be...
This is great, George. This is great. But meanwhile, he's creating these scenarios to protect himself so he could continue to exert creative control in Star Wars, even knowing that Bob Iger isn't budging on that.
But here's what he thinks. I can put Kathleen Kennedy in place as the leader at Lucasfilm, who's my girl that I've hand chosen. I have picked. She becomes a Disney employee with the acquisition, and George can, as you say, exert that creative control. So it wasn't like Kathleen Kennedy was, she certainly, you were talking earlier about what is her future with Disney. I don't think she has a future because she has no beginning with Disney. She's not a Disney player. She is somebody that George chose to come in and run the company. And I think, I hate to use this term, I think in some ways be a proxy, be a puppet for what he wanted to do.
Fair. That's fair speculation for sure. And Iger talks about it in the book. And as you're going to hear, that Iger sort of sees through this a little bit, but he also does show quite a bit of respect to Kathleen Kennedy. And I think that she is someone that Bob Iger likes working with. So let's hear it from Iger's book.
A few months before we closed the deal, George hired the producer Kathy Kennedy to run Lucasfilm. Kathy had co-founded Amblin Entertainment along with her husband Frank Marshall and Steven Spielberg, and had produced E.T. and the Jurassic Park franchise and dozens of critical and commercial hits. It was an interesting move on George's part. We were on the verge of buying the company, but he suddenly decided who was going to run it and ultimately produce the upcoming films. It didn't upset us, but it did come as a surprise, just as it surprised Kathy to learn that the company she was agreeing to run was about to be sold. Kathy is a legendary producer, and she has been a great partner. And this was one final way for George to put someone in whom he trusted to be the steward of his legacy.
That's it right there. He's installing someone that he trusts that will be his proxy, his representative, as the company gets folded into Disney Corporation. So, when I say that Kathleen Kennedy is going to be his proxy, his puppet, I don't mean that in a way that Kathleen Kennedy doesn't have a mind of her own. But George is just saying, look, I'm not going to be president and CEO of Lucasfilm and work for Disney, but I can install somebody who's going to be loyal to me, and then still have the future, the potential future, to be a rising star within the company. I think it was probably, given the circumstances, a pretty inspired move by George.
Yeah, well, he was trying to move pieces on the playing board while Iger was, and it appears, I think, at the end of the day, they didn't really, not to jump to any harsh conclusions here, but I really feel like Bob Iger pulled the wool over George's eyes, and I'm basing that all on the stuff that I'm hearing from Bob Iger's book itself. Iger did note that George was still uncomfortable with everything as it was going down the day Disney bought Lucasfilm. He was reading some of George's body language, and I have a brief clip here, cut 4, where he discusses that in the book.
On October 30th, 2012, George came to my office, and we sat at my desk and signed an agreement for Disney to buy Lucasfilm. He was doing everything he could not to show it, but I could tell in the sound of his voice and the look in his eyes how emotional it was for him. He was signing away Star Wars, after all.
Signing it away.
Yeah.
But still, I believe, under the impression that he'd be afforded the availability of playing in the sandbox. And with Iger holding on to those story treatments.
He was announced as executive consultant.
Right. In those famous sit-downs with Kathy Kennedy and from Lucasfilm. She's been there forever. Their director of communication.
Lynn Hale.
That's it, Lynn Hale.
Right.
Hello.
Yeah. Those round table YouTube videos. I think that was the first thing Lucasfilm put on YouTube, wasn't it?
Those were weird.
Those were really weird. They still exist. I don't know if they've removed those.
It's like you get the feeling that like somebody's holding a gun under the table, like Michael Corleone is waiting for Spalazzo to finish taking his bite of spaghetti so he can plug him in the throat.
It does look like a hostage situation. I don't know. I don't know who's holding who. beyond their will, but somebody is.
So at this moment in time, when that is happening, George realizes that he has relinquished control of Star Wars to the Disney company. But he still thinks he's set up the pieces on the playing board so he can move to his advantage.
Mm-hmm.
The story treatments and Kathy Kennedy. Yeah. So he's got these two things. And then they hire J.J. Abrams, and that would be in January. So that would be 2.5 months after.
Now, hold on. We forgot about Michael Arndt in this, because the one thing that I thought was different from what I believed to be the chronology as we were living it was that George chose Michael Arndt to flesh out his treatments for episode 7, but Michael was brought on board by Disney.
Now Iger does sort of infer that is what happened.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's really how it went down. I believe that Lucas and Kathleen Kennedy brought Michael Arndt into the fold as early as spring 2012.
Okay. Michael does have his history with Disney Pixar, having written, I believe, The Incredibles, and a number of other...
Toy Story 3?
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't The Incredibles. It was Toy Story 3, which was coming off of a huge success.
But I think Michael was handpicked by George to help him bang through these story treatments.
Okay. All right. That's not necessarily what Iger seems to infer.
I think that George turned over those story treatments to Disney in summer 2012. Summer 2012 is when he gave them those outlines. Maybe even later. Maybe even like September, But clearly before, and I think shortly before the agreement was reached and the sale was announced to the public on October 30th. 2012. So I think that those story treatments were only in Disney's possession for a short period of time before the paperwork got signed off and the agreement was reached. I don't think they had them very long. And I don't think that Iger ever intended to use those, because it's very clear to me that he only wanted to take the acquisition of Star Wars if George Lucas had no control. I think that's top priority for Iger. He makes it clear in the book all the way through. So George lays these treatments on him, and they don't use them. And the very first meeting for episode 1 is going to happen, or for episode 7 is going to happen at Skywalker Ranch.
This was tough to listen to.
This is tough because this is where Iger reveals his mistake. And his mistake was alienating George Lucas. For as many times that Bob Iger says in his book that he respects George and didn't want to mislead George, I think the basis of reality has nothing but a foundation in misleading George. So he sells Lucasfilm before the year 2012 ends. I think and that's why Bob had to be so careful. He didn't want to alienate George. He had to be so careful about that. He had to be careful he wasn't misrepresenting anything during the negotiations, because that's what he was doing. He was misrepresenting things. He bought George's treatment and had no desire to execute any of those ideas.
It was never going to be developed. It was never going to be developed.
Now, this is kind of interesting because we've heard rumors, and those rumors indicate to us that George actually is creatively involved in The Mandalorian.
Yes.
And that he has a writing credit that's available for the world to see on IMDb. And yeah, we know IMDb's crowdsourced as far as the information that gets posted there. But trust me, if that was something that Disney lawyers were uncomfortable with, they would have strucken that down right away. They would have had someone go in there and fix it. Believe me, IMDb responds when Disney rings the phone over there, and
I'm sure they do.
I think it's really interesting that George could actually be actively involved in Star Wars again. And maybe that's something that has given Iger the confidence to go public and really expose all this dirty laundry here about George Lucas, in the way that even Iger himself admits he may have led George astray a little bit and could have done things to alleviate the shock he received at that first meeting for episode 7.
So let's set the scene here. You've got, as far as George knew, the last thing George knew was that Disney had purchased his story treatments. And now here he is. He's about to go into a meeting with the director, J.J. Abrams, his hand-chosen successor, Kathleen Kennedy, and Bob Iger, to hear about.
No. Bob was not at the meeting.
Bob was not. No, it was. It was
Bob's
Kathleen.
Not at this meeting.
It was JJ.
He's got something else to do this day.
All right.
And
so
it was
here's
Michael Arndt.
It was Michael Arndt. That's right. So Michael Arndt, who we had been told up to this point was George's chosen writer.
Right.
So you got Arndt, J.J. Abrams, Kathleen Kennedy saying, "Hey George, here is episode 7."
Right.
Early on, Kathy brought J.J. and Michael Arndt up to Northern California to meet with George at his ranch and talk about their ideas for the film. George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that they weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. The truth was, Kathy, J.J., Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with J.J. and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start.
Betrayed.
Well, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
An unnecessarily rocky start. Here you've got the guy that created the entire universe that they're about to jump in and play around with. And Bob didn't feel compelled to give George the heads up that they were about to go in and not pitch, that's not the right word, present a story and a direction that has no connection to what George himself had. This is significant. You know, Iger does admit to 2 very big mistakes when it comes to Star Wars. This is the first one. The next one will be when he talks about the cadence and the release schedule of the films. But
Yes.
the first one is
He doesn't
not
talk
letting
about that. He doesn't talk about the release schedule in this book. That's
He mentions it very briefly. Or am I?
He did an interview with the New York Times that was released on Sunday.
In conjunction with the book,
right?
Right.
And that's
Yes.
where he made those quotes about the release schedule being
right. So he admits to 2 different errors. This being one, and this is a biggie. As you say, Jim, he goes out of his way throughout this chapter talking about how he's doing everything he can to show respect to George Lucas.
Yes.
But yet he doesn't quite think to give him the heads up that this meeting is about to go in a very different direction than what he's expecting. And
typical corporate executive because the deal had been done.
Right.
His work there was finished.
Right.
And George was just part of the negotiations.
George's collateral damage now. George's ego is
yes.
nothing but just a detail.
Right. And so he left his underlings to handle it. His underlings, in this case, being JJ and Kathleen Kennedy. I don't want to throw Arndt into that because I really feel like Michael Arndt was a pawn on this whole playing board, and he was just getting shuffled left and right and didn't know what the hell had hit him, you know. But
I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
I think Arndt was trying to hold on to his gig, and that was on shaky ground to begin with. And he really wanted to write the next Star Wars movie. He really wanted that. Why wouldn't he? And he really worked hard to at first work with George and then work with the Disney corporate structure and their direction of the future of Star Wars.
I'll tell you, I wouldn't be a bit surprised that to learn that JJ himself didn't know that George wasn't tipped off.
That could be. That very well could be. I
can't imagine J.J. Abrams going in with somebody who meant to him what we know George Lucas and his whole career has meant to him, going in there and blindsiding him. I don't think anybody was now Kathleen Kennedy, I don't know. I think the jury's still out. I just don't see J.J. Abrams as the kind of guy that wants to go in and completely blindside George Lucas. There's no upside for JJ on that.
I think he would have even demanded that George knew of this before the meeting, and maybe he was misled. Maybe JJ was led to believe that George was on board, and that they are using him as a consultant.
Right. Well, why would they?
Didn't
now,
want to
here's
have
a
anything
question.
to do with it.
Here's a question. Why would this meeting even need to happen? Why was this even necessary? If this meeting is being set up by Bob Iger or the Disney brass, under what pretense is it being set up? Are they asking for permission? Clearly not. Is it a courtesy? And if it's a courtesy, then why wasn't the courtesy extended prior so that George would have some foreknowledge of what it was that he was about to hear? I'm very baffled of why this meeting was even necessary.
That's a great question, man. I think it was probably arranged to let George know.
Yep. Because he was still in this consultant role.
And because they were under the impression that he could consult them and help them through everything. So they were honoring that part of the deal. But Iger does say in the book that consulting gig was something George was reluctant to do. George was reluctant to do it. What got George on board was Iger purchasing those story treatments from him. That was an inference of trust and that they were going to execute the ideas laid out in those story treatments. And I mean, why wouldn't they? Look at how Paramount treated Gene Roddenberry. There were a lot of things they wanted to do with the Star Trek franchise, but they respected Roddenberry and didn't make any drastic changes until after he passed away. And then Roddenberry was so respected that they found story treatments for an entirely different sci-fi series called Andromeda that they threw into production based on his outlines for that show after he had passed away. Yeah. I think that's how you respect a creative individual. Roll the dice on George's ideas. You have J.J. Abrams. You have Industrial Light and Magic. You have Kathleen Kennedy. You could create. You have Lawrence Kasdan.
Yeah. Now Lawrence Kasdan hasn't entered. I don't believe at this point.
Lawrence was on board.
Lawrence was on board at this point. Okay.
As far as Lucasfilm goes,
I see.
Because Kathleen Kennedy, I believe, had the idea to do spin-off stories before she knew the sale of Disney was going to go down. I think Kathleen Kennedy started to develop the ideas of things for like Rogue One and Solo and the Boba Fett film. Yeah, I think those were all part of her plan to make Star Wars something that could be seeing theatrical releases every year. I don't think those ideas for the Star Wars story films necessarily came from the Disney end. I think those were more or less baked in Kathy's kitchen at Lucasfilm. So, and that's fine. I mean, that's she's being aggressive about it. So they brought Kasdan on board to work on the Solo film. They brought him on board and basically said, "What do you want to do? We're bringing Star Wars back. Yeah. What do you want to do?" And he's like, "I got a lot to say about Han Solo. He's a character that always really interested me." And so they sent him to work on the Solo thing while George was hashing out the story treatments for the sequel trilogy with Michael Arndt. And I think they then ran into, they may have been consulting with Kasdan along the way as well on episode 7. But when push came to shove and Michael Arndt turned in his rough draft for episode 7, that's when they fired Michael Arndt.
Yeah. Arndt was struggling. Arndt was struggling with this.
Yes.
And I think it's based on the conditions that and the suppositions that were presented to him about what he needed to do in this film.
Yeah, he was, like I said,
his hands were tied.
He was a rock in a hard place. He's got Disney corporates telling him one thing. He's been working on something with George leading up to that. So now he's just kind of thrown into a mess here. JJ obviously starting to exert a lot of his influence. And I think Michael Arndt really got rolled over. But I mean, he tried to make it work. God bless him. Yep. And he was able to turn in the rough draft for The Force Awakens. And that's when JJ looked at it and decided he wanted to take matters in his own hands. They called up Kasdan and said, "Kasdan, you got to help us out here with this stuff. You wrote Star Wars films before. You can help us out." And so he did. And they banged out The Force Awakens. And so they finally got George then to sit down, because George was just like, "Oh man, this sucks." He's depressed.
Imagine that scene though. They're at the table. You're J.J. Abrams, Kathleen Kennedy, and Michael Arndt, and you're sitting there and you're talking about this. And within probably minutes of them opening it, George goes, "What are you talking about? This is
Vader's grandkids."
No, this isn't what I. This was what I wrote. Well, George, we decided we're going a different direction. Blah, blah. But I wouldn't be surprised to find out that George just left the room, walked out.
He just got up and walked out. Didn't even say anything to anyone.
Yeah, he's done. He's done. Well, speaking of done, we got to wrap things up. We've got so much to talk about. We've gone now. We're long in the tooth here. We're over 2 hours. We are over 2 hours.
Well, we got that breaking news.
We got the breaking news. It's huge. But look, this book isn't going anywhere, and neither is Rebel Force Radio. So this is we're going to leave you. This is a George Lucas style serial cliffhanger. So when last we left you, George Lucas just ended his meeting with Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams, and Michael Arndt as they're going over the ideas for episode 7. The movie goes into production. The question is, will George Lucas show up at the premiere? Will he badmouth Disney? There might even be a clause in the contract about whether or not he can. This is all coming to you next week here on Rebel Force Radio. This is Jim, you and I have talked many times about we wanted this story to come out. Of course, there's more details and more that we would like to come out. But the story is finally starting to be told. This from Bob Iger's perspective in this book. You have spent the last few days going through and combing through some of George Lucas's interviews and quotes going on record about this. At the end of the day, knowing that we're sort of leaving people off with a little bit of a cliffhanger, how does what we've heard so far line up with what we have heard George go on record to say? Is there a quote or something that we might refer to see how George's version of the story stacks up so far?
Well, I have some Charlie Rose quotes. he talks about being emotional, walking away. He talks about the influence these Bob Iger conversations had because he reflects on how long it would take him to make Star Wars films, and he didn't want to keep making movies until he's 80.
Right.
And the emotional difficulty he has with walking away from it all. But I think the bottom line is, and he almost talks like a kid about it. If you just want to leave us with cut one from the Charlie Rose thing, where George talks a little bit about, no, not cut one. Let's go with cut 4, where George really explains exactly what his hangups are with the Force Awakens, and then we'll go behind the scenes more next time on Rebel Force Radio. But this is just George's general hangups with the Force Awakens, and I think it kind of illustrates what sort of Star Wars movie he would have made if he got a chance.
They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different, and make them completely different with, different planets, with different spaceships, with different, to make it new.
So are you at peace with this?
Yeah.
As much as you can be.
Yeah. No, I said, look, I'm fine. Then you get to the thing, which is another thing that I'd been through. Fortunately, I'm old enough to have been through all this stuff before. And that one is to say, I had to do it. And then you do end up with this thing, which is, you got to live with it, and people are going to talk about it and all that kind of stuff. It's like talking about your divorce or something. It's awkward, but it's not painful.
It's awkward, but not painful. Wow. Wow. And Charlie says, are you at peace with it? He's like, yeah. But, it's like a divorce. I mean, he's not at peace with it.
How peaceful do you have friends who have gone through a divorce?
I do.
Ask them how peaceful they are.
Even years after.
Yeah, well, because people keep talking about it.
Right.
It doesn't go away. It's part of who you are and what makes you the individual and the person who's got a legacy. And George's legacy is now owned by the Disney Corporation, and I think that's become a tough pill for him to swallow.